Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. Okay. My name is Kayla Trujillo, and I'm a freshman top scholar and honors college student from Rio Bravo, Texas, majoring in politics and law. It is my pleasure to be here today to introduce Dr. Jill Florier. Dr. Florier is a professor of anthropology, associate dean of the Honors College, and associate dean for faculty success of the College of Liberal and Fine Arts. She graduated from Harvard College with a BA in anthropology, earned her MA in anthropology from San Diego State University, and earned a second MA and a PhD in anthropology from Stanford University. She is a fellow of the University of Texas System Academy of Distinguished Teachers, member of UTSA Academy of Distinguished Teacher Scholars, winner of the UT System Regents Outstanding Teaching Award, the UTSA President's Distinguished Achievement for Community Engagement, the UTSA President's Distinguished Achievement for Excellence in Teaching, the UTSA President's Distinguished Achievement for Excellence in University Service, and Richard S. Howe Outstanding Undergraduate Teaching Award, just to name a few. Dr. Florier is a cultural and medical anthropologist who specializes in health and the US-Mexico borderlands, caregiving in the United States, and the ways anthropology can have a direct impact on well-being. Her latest book is the topic of our discussion today, In Rhetoric and Reality on the US-Mexico Border, Place Politics Home. Dr. Florier examines the conflicting representations of the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas and explores new ways of thinking about change and opportunity for this critical part of our nation. As someone with deep roots in the Rio Grande Valley, Dr. Florier explores in her book the way we talk and think about the Rio Grande Valley as the border. She challenges common, widespread, and dangerous misunderstandings of the US-Mexico border. As someone who grew up with seeing the Rio Grande every day, I cannot emphasize how powerful this book is in portraying what it means to be a growing person from the border, aiming for change amidst a political world that tries time and time again to demean the culture and value we carry as people from the RGV. Dr. Florier is a passionate voice that wields her words and knowledge wisely to construct multiple accounts and stories, representing how the RGV has a positive present and future that is important not only to the people residing in the valley, but to the nation as well. She utilizes her research to disclose the reality on issues talked about by bystanders, not fully understanding the RGV experience, and does an outstanding job on her narratives and factual accounts in Rhetoric and Reality on the US-Mexico Border, Place Politics Home. One of the beauties of our conversation today is that it highlights the importance of having conversations about places that shape national policy. And by conversations like this, multiple experts from different industries and academic disciplines and the public, especially students as stewards of our future. Also notable is the role of UTSA as an HSI in South Texas to do this kind of work for our region and for our communities, the importance of South Texas to our state and nation. This book was compelling in the way that it debunks a lot of the negative perspectives we see on the borderlands in the valley and ensures that there are generations of leaders from this area that are actively working together to bring about a truer vision to the place in which I grew up in and love and care so deeply about. Politicians and many media commonly portray the US-Mexico border as a place of menace and intractable challenge, rather than a historic region with a powerful legacy of resilience and an abundance of promise. Today, Dr. Florier has brought together a wide array of voices, scholars, educators, and journalists so that we may discuss and learn together. It is my honor now to welcome Dr. Jill Florier. Guests, please help me in welcoming to the stage, Dr. Florier.
I am so excited to be up here so I can say thank you to Kayla for that lovely introduction, and also to every single person that is in the room here and also watching via live stream. In the next 10 minutes, I am going to just talk a little bit about why I think this conversation about our US-Mexico borderlands is so important, and the way I went about writing the book. And then I'll close with a brief invitation, and then we'll move into our panelist conversation. First, I want to say a few thank yous. This event could not have happened without Christy Meyer, Melissa Foster, and Batul Asmat. This is the third time we have scheduled this. COVID has kept us waiting, and this is just Valley persistence and perseverance in action. I also wanted to thank all of the students, current and former, graduate and undergraduate, who have read the book. One of the reasons why I wrote the book was for students, and I went with a press, Palgrave Macmillan, that allows the majority of American college students to read the book for free. To my panelists, I am honored and humbled by the work that you do. I am so grateful to be with you today and all of the times that I have had conversations about the border. And then also finally to my family and friends and colleagues who have spent hours talking about the border, the valley, and Jill, where is that valley again? With me over the years, and the over 110 valley leaders who spent over 4 years with me as I collected the data for this book. So to the book. The question I want to leave you with today is, how do you know a place? I mean, really know a place. So think for a minute with me about, in your mind, your happy place, your vacation place. Where do you go to chill out? Think about what it looks like, what the weather feels like, what season it is in your mind, what's around you, what are the structures, who are the people, what are the activities that you're doing. Now, the majority of you probably would not have thought about the US-Mexico border as your happy place or your vacation place, but I do, and I think of two places. Now, mind you, I'm not there in the summer when it's too hot. I'm there in late fall in my mind, or early spring. And the first place I'm at is South Padre Island, no tourists, just locals. And I'm walking at the beach at dawn with other people that are from the region. And there are a few people fishing. I'm on the beach side, not the bay side. And that's one place I go to in my mind. The second place I go to in my mind is my parents' backyard. And I can hear the chachalacas fighting in the brush. I can hear the zooming Mexican green parrots overhead with the whistling ducks. I can also feel the breeze because it's in the evening. So the coastal breezes come in and I can feel the grass on my feet, and there are family around me. Now, not everybody's going to go to their childhood home for their happy place. Not everybody from the valley will go to the valley for their happy place. But what this speaks to is how profound personal experiences is in knowing a place. But so many of us haven't been to the US-Mexico border, and instead we have to use secondhand information to learn about that location. And that's primarily through media, through news media, through social media, through pictures. Do this for me. Everybody pull out your phones and open up your browser and type in the border and then click images. When I pull out my phone and I type in the border in the browser and I click images, there are three dominant kinds of images I see. The first one is of a desolate landscape that has a border wall or fence running through it. You don't see animals, you don't see people. It's bleak, it's far away. The second kind of picture that I see on my phone when I do that search are people in a state of desperation. The third picture I would see if I were to look at that picture are congested, exhaust-filled lines at our ports of entry. If you look at those kinds of pictures, that's not a place you want to be. And that indeed is the national story that we tell about the US-Mexico border. It's a place you don't want to be. In the 2010s, the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, our four southernmost counties, that was the emblematic border in our national news. I looked at over 780 articles, actually more than looked. I did repetitive iterative coding for all of you nerds out there. And it was from across major news outlets. It was NPR, it was Fox, it was the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Associated Press, USA Today, and many others. And they were both transcripts from the TV and media that we see online, as well as written. And over again, with a few exceptions, Edgar Sandoval's work being one, who's up here, the national story was that the border is a place of menace, it's far away, and it's out of control, and it needs state and national intervention. In fact, you can find these stories in today's headlines. It's a different place and not in a good way. The national story is that it is more corrupt, more porous, more poor, more unhealthy, and largely of its own doing. This is a common narrative that we attribute in the global north to the global south. It's a way we construct difference, and we say those people are different from us, and we are better. And here's an exemplar quotation from the Associated Press in 2011. This is how it opens. A nervous man with a duffel bag of marijuana, a pack of snorting feral pigs, a woman holding a child's hand, a fluttering, rustling plastic bag. There's plenty for a National Guardsman to look at on a quiet South Texas night. Now, journalists understand, and I spoke with journalists and editors as well at the local and state level, they understand the tension between changing the narrative about the border, but also resonating with a national audience. One told me, we ignore the valley at our peril, and yet journalistically, we have only paid attention to the valley when something pokes up, either good or bad. So much of the state's future is whether or not we get the valley right. I think the combination of UT Pan American and UT Brownsville into UT Rio Grande Valley, the onboarding of the medical school is only the visible part of the iceberg. So why is that the border story that we hear so often? It's a very, very old story about Mexico and immigration from Mexico and Central America that rises, as other social scientists have demonstrated, during times of economic crisis and political and social upheaval. It's a form of scapegoating. It's not a news story that we heard in the 2016 election or 2020 or our state elections or right now. It's something that's been around for more than 150 years. And it's a story our nation tells out of fear and the lack of personal experience. It is a social processing of bordering, again, between us and them. So in the book, I contrast that national story, which is incomplete, often inaccurate or inconsistent, with a local story from Valley leaders. And by leaders, I spoke to people in politics, like national senators and people in the gubernatorial office, people in law enforcement, like chiefs of police, healthcare, CEOs and doctors and nonprofits and for-profit healthcare organizations, activism in housing, in immigration, environment and sustainability, economy, heads of economic development chambers, CEOs of banks, for example, education, superintendents, school board members, and journalists. And I did that for over 4 years, 22 wonderful trips down. And here's what they say. They say the Rio Grande Valley is emblematic of the border, but the border is the future of our state and a nation because we are resilient, we have potential, and we know how to do binational relationships right. You look at the people who bring in tens of billions of dollars into our state every year, it's through our border ports. Laredo surpassed LA in terms of what it brings in terms of GDP several years ago. But it is a misunderstood place, but it is our home. The border is a place of promise, resilience, and partnership. And it is quintessentially American because it is next to Mexico. And that's a radical idea. And the way they demonstrate that is they say that in Mexico and in the United States, we share core values of family, hard work, perseverance, community, faith, and entrepreneurialism. And in the Valley, they are compounded. And we have such a flow of ideas and people and things that new ideas and new social formations can come about. Problems? Yes, they said we have them, but we have solutions too. And they would refer to the University of Texas at Rio Grande Valley as the first ever public institution that was intentionally designed as bilingual, biliterate, and bicultural. And in our globalized world, isn't that the least of what we can do in order to prepare our nation for that world? Now, there are other border stories, of course. I could have written many books, but that's the point. We need more stories about our borderlands, not only from South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley, but all across the borderlands. So today I invite you to know the US-Mexico border differently from the perspectives of people in the book and on this panel, people who live or are from the Rio Grande Valley and people who have committed their lives to understanding and improving the well-being of this region of our borderlands in South Texas. Each has their own border story, and together our stories will give you, I hope, a more nuanced and new way to think about our southern borderlands. Thank you.
This is not performance art. This is me, John Philip Santos. I teach in the Honors College. I'm a writer and media producer. After a series of cascading senior moments, I printed out the bios I was going to read, but failed to pick them up out of the printer. I was having some issues with the printer, and no problem because I had them on my phone, but somehow the phone has disappeared in the last hour. So I'm going to read these bios, and I apologize to my distinguished colleagues on the panel. I'm going to read them from 3 different phones. So that's why I say this is not performance art. First of all, and we're so honored to have with us Julieta Garcia. Dr. Garcia, communications at UTRGV, is the former president of the University of Texas at Brownsville. She is a nationally esteemed higher education champion, and in 2004 was named President of the Year in Time magazine. She earned her doctorate in communications and linguistics from the University of Texas at Austin, both bachelor's and master's degrees from University of Houston. She and a group of community leaders spearheaded the establishment of the University of Texas at Brownsville, the first university south of I-10. She served as president of Texas Southmost College, becoming the first Mexican-American woman in the nation to serve as president of a college or a university. She and community leaders then forged a partnership between the existing community college, TSC, and the new university, UT Brownsville, creating the first community university of its kind in the nation. Julieta has also had a strong history of public service. She served as a chair of the advisory committee to Congress on student financial assistance and on the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for Hispanic Americans, a panel that I served with her on, and so happy to be together again. More recently, she was a member of the President-elect Obama's, this was a slightly older bio here, the transition team for President Obama. She's received awards from the Texas Women's Hall of Fame for Lifetime Achievement in Education and Hispanic Heritage Award. She was named one of the top 10 college presidents by Time magazine and the winner of the Otley Award given by the government of Mexico to Mexicans in the United States who work on behalf of Mexican folks. Second, we have Dr. Jerry Gonzalez, my colleague here at UTSA. He is Associate Professor of History here at UTSA, Director of the UTSA Mexico Center, and the Principal Investigator of the extraordinarily impactful UTSA Mellon's Humanities Pathways Grant, which supports a lot of work of our undergrad students and their pathway to graduate education. He's also a faculty fellow in the People's Academy, sponsored by the Democratizing Racial Justice Project in the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UTSA. His research interests in Latinx metropolitan history and identity, transnational and transregional migrations, and the US-Mexico borderlands inform the courses that he teaches in history and American studies. Prior to arriving at UTSA, he spent 2009-2010 as a chancellor's postdoctoral research associate in the Latinx Studies Department at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he began work on his book, In Search of the Mexican Beverly Hills, Latino Suburbanization in Post-War Los Angeles, published in 2018 by Rutgers University Press in the Latinidad Transnational Cultures in the United States series. His current research on the emergence of San Antonio as a leading center for Sin Fronteras organizing and activism in the 1970s contributes to current conversations about Latinx migrants, remaking the US cities and metropolitan regions. Lastly, we have with us, extraordinarily proud also to have with us today, Edgar Sandoval, correspondent for the New York Times, who's been doing extraordinary work for the New York Times, extraordinary coverage of what's been happening in the Valley in the time of COVID. Edgar was born in Los Angeles, but he spent most of his childhood in a small Mexican town where his father owned a welding shop. In the mid-1990s, he moved with his family to the Rio Grande and grew up in the south of the Rio Grande Valley in Mission, Texas, where he began his journalism career at the Monitor in McAllen. Edgar worked at the Los Angeles Times, the Morning Call in Allentown, and the South Florida Sun Sentinel, a compilation of his immersive narrative stories on Allentown's Latino population, the new face of small town America, was published by Penn State Press in 2010. Before joining the Times, Edgar worked for the New York Daily News, covering local and national stories. He joined the Times in 2019 as a freelance reporter covering criminal justice in New York. And Edgar made his mark in South Texas when he was asked to cover the impact of the coronavirus on border communities, including heart-wrenching tales about a rural hospital with no ICU, but dozens of critically ill COVID patients, a funeral director who had never buried so many people, and a front page story by a Mexican-American writer, a Mexican-American correspondent in the New York Times, something that just knocked me aback, coverage of his own family's struggle with the coronavirus. So please welcome all three of our panelists and forgive this halting introduction on 3 different phones. Thank you very much. So I'll begin some questions, then we can move into some Q&A from all of you shortly. In Jill's introduction, she talked a lot about the important focus of the book, contrasting the way the border is represented in the media and the stories she heard in her interviews across the valley and throughout the borderlands. I wonder if, Jill, you might say a little more about the mix of sociology and anthropology that you used to create the framework of the book and how it shaped the kinds of findings that you got to in the writing of it. Yep.
Thank you, John Philip. So anthropology, an easy way to understand the method is walk a mile in their shoes. So you never can truly be someone else. But what anthropology believes is that we learn the most from people when we live with them day in and day out, and we can do the things that they do. And so, for example, when you're talking about the border, as an anthropologist, you have to be in the border. You have to live in the border. And in terms of being with leaders, it was easy for me because I come from a family of leaders in the Valley. And so one of the ways I started my work was I just started asking friends and family members, who do you respect in the area of, right? And then once I met with them, I'd say, who do you respect in the area, in your area, and who has been most influential to you? And so I would trace out these networks that began with my own networks, but then quickly extended past them. And so one of the things I would do is to go to, I would go to Texas Tribune events where leaders would gather and they would talk about the border and the borderlands. But I also would go to awards, I'd go to speeches, I'd go, and I went to ritual events, right? I went to weddings, I went to funerals, I went to my high school reunion. Those are all things that the anthropologists do. But because I was working with leaders, I couldn't live with them and in their spaces as much as other anthropologists have done in smaller communities. And so I substituted that with a series of interviews and focus groups. And then I also collected their cultural texts. So those things that they had written for the public about the representations of the border as well. Did that get at that?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you also about just the question of being from Harlingen.
Oh, right.
So, for a long time among anthropologists and in the sort of academic practice of anthropology, it's often been thought to be wary about reporting or studying the place you come from.
Yep.
And for that reason, we haven't had many borderland studies by people who come from the border. So what has it meant in terms of your knowledge of the RGV specifically in shaping the work that you undertook for this book?
So that's a great question. I would answer it in 2 ways. One is the history of anthropology, as we worked as an arm of colonial governments to go understand different people that we assumed were going to be different from us. And so we had a long history that started to get critically analyzed by anthropologists and others in the 60s and the 70s, saying, hold on, you're making a lot of assumptions about difference, and maybe you should study yourself as much as you study other people. And of course, as soon as you start to do that, you realize how much bias everybody has about a place and about a people. And so a lot of what anthropology at home is, which is what I was doing, was talking to different colleagues and family members. Am I getting this right? Am I getting this wrong? Milena Mello, who's a professor at UTRGV, is in the audience. I remember having a conversation, one of our famous walk and talks, where she's like, you do know what people think about Harlingen, right? And then she's like, and by the way, that happens with all the cities. And that really got me thinking about the biases, not only that I bring into it, but that people in the border also have about each other. And that shaped how I wrote the book as well. But there have been a number of anthropologists now that are looking back at their own communities and being very reflexive and critical about what do I bring to the table and what do I not bring to the table.
I mean, that's going to be a fascinating part of the next 10 years or so, as we see these studies beginning to inform the kind of the feedback loop that you described in your overview of the book in your remarks, how that might be able to positively affect that negative feedback loop. But yet that your long-standing work on behalf of higher education in the Valley has been so impactful in changing really the landscape of the Valley. What role does higher education play in addressing the kind of disconnect that Jill describes in her book between media representations and the world that you know as a native of Brownsville and someone who has a long history in your family of life in the borderland? How has higher education been affected?
Well, thank you first for the topic and for the opportunity to have this conversation and to meet with new colleagues on this issue. And thank you for all of you who came to listen and to learn more about the Valley. I spent my life in the Valley, and so I would leave only to get educated or to give a presentation or to fight somebody that I needed to in order to bring resources back to the Valley. And so it's always been my headquarters. And I remember going to New York or to DC or wherever I was at the time, and somebody would ask, "Are you still in the Valley? Like, do you need a map? Why haven't you left? I mean, surely, you're educated enough, and it struck me that this would occur over and over and over again. I said, I don't need a map. I know where I am. And we have great purpose in our work. So the first thing I had to do every time I broke through that filter of leaving the Rio Grande to go even to Austin, I had to talk a little different to communicate in Austin. But I had to first understand that I was in a different place. So frame of references were going to be different. And then I had to tell quickly in a short paragraph, and I got really good at doing that, where the Valley is, what that means. And so I would describe interface zones. And in biology, we buy plants that we can grow in our zone, and they'll tell us which zone you live in and what kind of plants to live there. But they're also, in science, interface zones, where you're just at the edge of the beginning of one zone and just at the end of the beginning of another zone. So what happens to plants and animals there in that interface zone, which is a scientific term, is that both animals and plants have to mutate a bit. Now, you don't want to call faculty mutants, right? Or your friends or your family. So hybrids was a better word, but they are a little different. All of us who grow up in the Rio Grande Valley are a bit different than if we grew up in Monterrey, where my father was from, or in Camargo, right across the border, or Matamoros, Reynosa, or if I had grown up in Austin or Houston. Even my primas that grew up in Corpus spoke English differently and had much less command of Spanish. So there is just an interface zone right along the border that beautifully allows us to convene, sometimes to convene and clash cultures, sometimes economic systems. So we all learn the difference between dollars and pesos as we're growing up, and we can convert them in our heads, or between metric systems of all kinds. We learn how to live in those two different worlds, thinking we're not unique. everybody does this until you leave the valley. And then you get to San Marcos or to Austin or Houston or wherever, and you start to talk about things, and they look at you a little strange, and you begin to understand that you've been in an interface zone without knowing the word. So what Jill's book, Dr. Florier's book, began to give me as I read it, I was just floored, because while you live it doesn't mean you know how to define it. I would define it in the way I've just described. But Dr. Florier's book gave me other words to use from anthropological studies to define what happens in the valley. The cemetery where my grandmother and grandfather are buried in Harlingen. If you go and see the historical marker there, it says that historically, the Anglos would be buried separately from the Hispanics, who would be buried separately from the Blacks, who would be buried separately from the babies. I'm not sure why the babies in one section. And I remember looking at that, and then I looked immediately, where the graves of my grandmother and grandfather, right? Where did they land in this interesting place? So Dr. Florier's book helped me view my own history with words and ideas that I had never thought to apply to them. So I stood there at the cemetery, looked to the right at carefully maintained burial plots. And then I looked to my left on the border line of the cemetery, and there was cactus growing up, the gravestones. And this is, this day and time. Now I've since talked to the mayor, and now I went this last week just so I could tell the story. Everything's fixed. But that one day when I was there, I saw in real time cactus growing up on one side and beautifully manicured plots, the city cemetery. And that tells our story in so many interesting ways. So I forget the question, but but just to give you a taste.
Well, I'll return to just something we were talking about a little earlier, which is the focus in Brownsville of so many lives of intellectuals and civic leaders, J.T. Canales and Carlos Castañeda, Américo Paredes, yourself, and the way that higher education has been cultivated there out of a very different rooting. In many cases, in the case of Paredes, for instance, rooting in Spanish letters and a deep history in the period of colonial New Spain, and so much of that is carried forward in the work. How has the cultivation of university culture in Brownsville and at UTRGV now, how has that impacted the kind of issues that Jill focuses on in this book?
Well, so let me speak to higher ed then specifically. My mother graduated as salutatorian of her high school graduating class, and she was one of the honor students at Harlingen High School. I'm very proud to be able to say that. The story in our family, though, was she missed it by a fraction of a point because there was no way a Mexicana was going to be graduating as the valedictorian. It was a little bit of a bitterness there, right? Not from my mother, but my father, of course, defending the honor of his wife. My father graduated with Américo Paredes from Brownsville High School. When I met my Américo years later, he said, "¿De quién eres?" And I told him, Romeo Villarreal, and he goes, I knew your father. We went to school together. And he went on and on. But so my father published a poem in Spanish in the Palmillan, which was the high school newspaper at the time. There was nothing wrong with my mother and father's brain. They were ready to go to college, even in the time of the Depression. But neither of them got to go to college. And I remember my father years later saying, "You see that girl? I made better grades than she did in geometry," or things like that. Or, "I always wanted to go to pharmacy school. Sorry, I didn't get to go." They died with a yearning for higher education. They did not get to go because to go to college for the most part meant leaving the valley. And if you were not mobile, you could not do that, or you did not have money, or if you did not have the responsibility for your family, you could not do that. Or if you didn't, so the second part of the irony for me was there was a college called Texas Southmost College in Brownsville. It started in 1926. Little known fact, it was the first, not the last, the first junior college to be certified by the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, which is our accreditation agency, the first in the state of Texas. And so I would think, how can that be? How can Texas Southmost College, then known as Brownsville Junior College, how is it that it could have been the first in the state? And we often think by the time it gets to the valley, it's because it was already everywhere else, right? It wasn't. So what happened? What happened in that gap that caused the rest of the state to move ahead? And for the pioneers who started the college in 26 to then get stuck and not be able to move forward. So my task then was to make sure that no longer would people like my mother and father, and there were hundreds and thousands of them, would ever miss out on higher education again, just because we didn't have it accessible there and not move forward. So higher ed for us in the Valley meant opening the doors to all kinds of opportunity and looking at ourselves as assets, not deficits. Not what's wrong with people in the Valley. Al contrario, what's right about them? These people can speak in 2 languages. They can calculate in 2 languages. They know how to measure in 2 languages. And you're telling me they can't go to school because they don't have opportunities enough to do that.
Jerry, another big force in affecting the direction of the representations that are so much the focus of this book is the work of historians. And we could say almost beginning, well, certainly with Carlos Castañeda, who was an historian and archivist who established the repositories and archives that could give historians a toehold into telling a larger story about South Texas and the Valley. But what role have historians played in shaping the narrative that is referred to in this book? And where do you see that going in the near horizon, sort of in the next generation of historians working in the region?
That's a great question. It's a huge question. How much time does everybody have? So first, I'd also like to start out by thanking my co-panelists and Dr. Florier for publishing this really beautiful book that I think called upon a number of resonances with my own research, with me individually. So just FYI, full disclosure, I'm not from the Valley and I'm not from Texas, but I still recognize the really significant relationships shared across space and time between places like the RGV and places like the SGV in LA, a place that I wrote about in my first book, the San Gabriel Valley. And so to more directly address the question, John Philip, I see a number of themes throughout Jill's really brilliant book that are linked or tied to various historical and historiographical moves. Certainly, I think one of the more prominent themes in the text is the counterinsurgent language used to describe the border. And so you see this emergence of this language. Certainly, I think the focus has been on the Trump years, but clearly years prior. As an urban historian, that language really resonated with me because it's the kind of language that city leaders and developers have called upon historically to begin to redevelop barrios, to redevelop urban neighborhoods. And I think we see that, particularly with the last president, who was a developer, there was a very clear messaging that this is a place of danger, this is a place that needs to be redeveloped in a particular way to construct and craft the edifices of a new emergent nation. And that happened in multiple places across the United States and multiple barrios across the United States, and I imagine also in the RGV. So one of those, so that theme I think really resonated with me as an urban historian, that that folks are trying to flip the script so to speak, right? That barrio residents have often defended and protected, whether it was on the streets or in city council meetings or as scholars, the value of their homes, the value of their places. And I think that also resonates with a number of the other themes in the text that, that organic intellectuals, maybe not folks with PhDs, but folks who emerge from these communities give oftentimes more powerful testimony than scholars do about why these spaces matter, about why the bulldozers should stay at bay, why walls aren't welcome, right? And so I think that historians have really dug into the deep past to recover these voices, to recover these narratives, and then to, I think, in some ways also demonstrate that this idea of a border, this idea of a fixed line, is actually just an idea. That when we look at the natural history of the border, natural history of the Rio Bravo, it moves. Which means that, prior to, I forget which year, somebody could look it up on their phone, but prior to the detailed outline of latitude and longitudinal lines, the river was actually the border. And so the border moved with every flood, with every downpour. And so I think a number of historians have really taken to the natural history of the borderlands to demonstrate that this is not a fixed place. There is no a clear line of demarcation between the global north and the global south. A few terms that Dr. Florier really challenges. So I probably could go on and on, but I shouldn't. But I hope that gives a little bit of a taste of what's going on.
Yes, and actually sidebar fact, maybe not speaking out of school here, but Flipping the Script was one of Jill's early working titles for this book. So maybe you were honing in on that psychically. But speaking of scripts, so much of this book deals with distortions propagated by the media, by reportage. Well, I think, and I'm not trying to flatter Edgar here, but I think there will be a time when people talk about pre-ES reporting from the Valley, Edgar Sandoval reporting from the Valley, and post-Edgar Sandoval reporting from the Valley. I remember one occasion, one of the stories I referred to in his introduction had to do with a funeral home that was overbooked. It was a conversation between a family member and a funeral director. And Edgar in his reporting said, they're having this conversation and the family member says, pénala bien. That appeared in the New York Times, pénala bien. I mean, it almost made me weep to see that usage in the New York Times without a kind of objectifying contextualization by a kind of a foreign reporter as if they were reporting on some distant land. To hear the language used in our world, in the greater borderlands, in the New York Times was just remarkable. I'm going to kind of ask a question very similar to what I asked Jill, which is, what has it meant for your reporting that you come from that world? What is it that you have been able to bring to your reportage out of the reservoir of experiences growing up there? And how has it been dealt with at the New York Times?
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the lovely introduction and company of this, scholarly people. I'm not a scholar by any means. I'm just a journalist. But yeah, not to correct you on that quote, but I think it was pénala to the side.
Oh, pénala to the side.
And it was important for me to include Spanglish because that's how people speak, And growing up, because I ended up in the Valley in the mid-1990s, so I consider it growing up from teenager to college. And I just heard, I grew up hearing Spanglish everywhere. When you go to the store, when you talk to your family, the languages just interchange, automatically. You don't stop and think about what did you say, what does the word mean. It's just vamos al store para comprar milk. You know, it's it's just part of the language there. So I wanted to bring that authenticity to the stories, and there were discussions about it. You know, it wasn't really accepted at first. Is this how readers would understand what you're talking about? And we had to have. It wasn't a long discussion, but it was a discussion that needed to be had. And I had to stand my ground and say no, even if it's one quote or three quotes in the whole story that sound like this, they need to be in the story because this is. I kind of said, if you want me to cover the border, this is what the border sounds like. And they got it. I mean, once I explained to them, you know, this is how the border sounds. It wasn't just a typo. It wasn't a mistake. You know, my Microsoft didn't autocorrect me to English. But you know, being from there, it can be a double-edged sword because, you know, when I cover Latinos in Pennsylvania, for example, that was a new area for me. And you can see everything with fresh eyes, you know. And sometimes coming back to the border, I really have to open my eyes and see, okay, this is familiar to me, but what's new for people in New York or, you know, Oklahoma or other states. So it's kind of a challenge for me to step back and explain things to people who are not from Texas. So I'm writing for Texans and also I'm writing for the people in other parts of the country to understand a little bit about the border.
And the initial piece, that front page piece that I referenced, that was the first, right, of the series?
That was the first, yes.
That dealt with your family.
Correct.
Specifically.
That was the
So
first,
not only out of the place you came up, but your family itself.
right. That was the first in the COVID series. So I was working just to give you some background. I was a reporter. I was new to the Times, working what we call Metro, which is covering New York. And then when the COVID was really impacting the country, not just the border, the numbers were pretty bad here, San Antonio and also McAllen area. And they asked for volunteers. The reporters were overworked. They needed someone to come, you know, help out with the reporting. And I said, I'm from the Valley. I can go down there and help cover this. I thought I was going to come here and send them a couple of paragraphs and then be done with the story, right? I thought I was going to go see my family on Sunday, have Applebee's, and then start reporting on Monday for my article. But it just turned out that I'm making my way to McAllen. Everyone was kind of becoming part of the trend and falling ill with COVID. So when I told the editors, they got really excited. They said, this is a story. And I said, well, let me just wait to make sure they're okay first. So I kind of dealt with my family's health first. And when things were clear, so to speak, then I sat down and wrote that story.
I'll ask one more question, then go to all of you for questions as well. You know, a key part of the construction of the analysis in the book has to do with this this triangle of terms that Jill uses: bordering, something we're very familiar with in the history of the Texas-Mexico partition, rebordering, and then the revelation for me that this is something that's talked about in the Valley, debordering. And this is a question for all of you to respond to, just in terms of that nomenclature and the way that it affects your respective work on these themes. Jill, do you want to start, or Julieta?
The reason we started UT Brownsville and then UTRGV with the mission of the 3 Bs, bilingual, bicultural, biliterate, is because we wanted to flip the switch from what's wrong with these kids, how can we fix them so that they look like they went to UT Austin. That's the one I would always use. And I love UT Austin. I went to UT Austin. But I know what people saw and looked at us like. And I always felt like, don't worry, if you just work hard enough, you can look like us, talk like us, act like us, and you'll get there eventually. And I kept thinking about, well, what was wrong with the way I looked when I walked in, or what was right about the way we looked? And so we flipped it and said, well, let's build a university based on the assets of the population. What do these students bring to us? They are already bilingual. They are, most of them, not biliterate. They can't read and write in both languages. Why? Because most of them have been taught only in English. So why would you expect them to be biliterate in Spanish, right? So hone skills in both languages concurrently, and then help them. And they're already bicultural. They can work on both sides of the border. They can do a business deal in Chicago or in Buenos Aires or in Mexico City. They can flip the switch in their heads. They know how to act differently. We would do it all the time, daily, and more if we went into the interior of both countries, right? So they're already bicultural. They're already bilingual, not in both languages to the professional level. And then if we made them biliterate and then made them engineers or lawyers or teachers or doctors, oh my gosh, here's my dream. Okay, it still is my dream that someday a perhaps future governor of Texas will wake up and he'll say, or she'll say, how fortunate we are to have all of these bilingual, biliterate, bicultural people in our state. Now, right now, that sounds pretty much like a fantasy, no? But imagine if they flipped it themselves and said, now, what can we do with this strength? We can, I mean, there is a global economy, right, that needs people like the ones that we're graduating. That's an advantage in a global environment to do business in two languages, in two cultures, across political boundaries. Our chess kids, I'll talk about chess at the end, but our chess kids play chess with kids from all over the world. Our physics majors do physics with students from all over the world. Our musicians don't care if you don't know English. If you can play the violin really well, we want you in our orchestra. So there are already places where we learn to cross borders because we're more interested in the chess game or in the violin or in the composition than we are in finding differences. So what if we could build a university that said, welcome you with what you have. Now, once that you're here, then we're going to hone your skills in both languages. We're going to teach you the professional language of your field. If it's medicine, when you're going to provide healthcare, one of the most important factors that determines the quality of healthcare is being able to communicate with the person on the other end that needs it. And so if we, and at any rate, and if we do that really well, given the demographic shift that we know is going on in Texas and in the United States, then our graduate in engineering or in law or in medicine would be marketable nationwide, worldwide. So the essence of the mission of what was going to be UT Brownsville as a separate and autonomous institution that then became UT RGV is that we start with an asset base and not a deficit base.
Bordering, rebordering, debordering?
Do you want to go?
Debordering. That sounds very much like debordering.
Yeah, this is a great question, John Philip. I think in working with folks in the present and also in history, it's very apparent that Mexican origin communities live in this liminal space where the border is both immaterial but also very material, right? I think about the even my own family history that in 1914, my great-grandparents left Zacatecas in the middle of the Mexican Revolution, crossed a very real border, but landed, crossed through El Chuco, through El Paso, landed in Oxnard, California to pick sugar beets, and then eventually settled in East LA, in a place that was marked and defined by multiple boundaries and borders and debordering practices, right? It was a very diverse place. There was a large contingent of Mexicanos there, but there were also a large contingent of Italians and Russian Jews and folks who had fled various other social and political ills in their countries, fled real borders to create communities that were without borders. And so reflecting on this personal history really helps me to approach and think through the folks that I encounter and meet in the archives or in oral history interviews, or just in passing in pages of secondary texts like Jill's, that they're actively doing this work, even if they're not particularly conscious of the work that they're doing, right? So I think for me, especially now in this current project in San Antonio, I'm looking at a cohort of folks who are very cognizant of the uses of the border to control labor, to advance national security interests, to create divisions amongst people in communities and in neighborhoods on the basis of citizenship, right? And at the same time, those same people working against those very forces, right? Split families, families where people have citizenship and don't have citizenship, actively pushing against the borders within their own households, right? So I think it's a important question. It's a profound question. It's something that brings nuance and complexity into any historical study, any modern day study, really. Right? It connects the histories to the present. It connects the present to the past. So,
Edgar, has the D word come up at all in any of your reporting? Has the idea of debordering been broached in any of the contexts you've made?
Well, I think I might take debordering more figuratively and not literally. Like Dr. Florier mentioned in her book very eloquently, that the word border evokes certain descriptions, right? Crime, immigration crisis, poverty. And you can't avoid those challenges in the story because there are real challenges facing the region, but also there are some opportunities where you can actually write about everyday people without bringing any of those terms into the story. I'm thinking of a story I wrote about why vaccination rates were so high in the Valley compared to the rest of the state. And the people that I featured in that story were middle class. One was a judge. So the word immigration, poverty, and crisis were not in the story at all, or hopefully just like underplayed. It wasn't the thesis of the story, right? So I think there's stories out there that we can tell where we don't have to always identify the border as this out of control, quote unquote, place. I mean, sometimes you can't avoid the challenges, like I said, and you have to approach them head on with dignity, and always showcase people's resilience. I think that's what makes, it's not just everyone's these categories, but the fact that they're pushing forward and there's a fighting spirit to become better.
And Jill, maybe just last thought from you in terms of this question. We're well familiar with the bordering and the rebordering part.
Yes.
Where does the debordering stand? And where did that get picked up for you as a kind of a theme for your findings?
So what I saw leaders saying over time and time again was the Valley has been a place of division for so long. It's been a place of racial division, class division, principally. Those were but then you could also look at city divisions and county divisions, and that allocations of resources were based on which one you fell into. And what they really wanted to do was say, we are going to offer a new way of thinking about solutions to the challenges that we do have, like high rates of poverty, chronic health conditions like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And what they proposed was working across lines of difference. And so when you would talk to leaders about the story of UTRGV, we used to have, and there's still some Friday Night Lights mentality between the cities and the counties, but they said we are stronger as a region if we reach across our city divides, we reach across our county divides, and we speak as a region and become powerful as a region. And so the way they saw debordering was by saying, we recognize the differences and we're going to extend our hands across those divisions so that we can create resource and we can develop the potential. And they would refer to that. They'd also refer to SpaceX, and they would also refer to the Binational Economic Development Zone as evidence of the ways in which debordering actually helps not only the region, but then the state in the ways that Dr. Garcia was talking about.
One of the things that would happen to all of us who are from the Valley is that when you would leave, notice I said the Valley, right, or El Valle, but people didn't care if I was from Mission or Brownsville or wherever. They just said, oh, you're from the Valley. And it meant whatever is in their head that meant, right, good or bad or in between. Everywhere else, we were one. We were already one unit, the Valley. But in the Valley, we were Mercedes or Mission or Hidalgo County or Cameron County and working against each other historically and competing unsuccessfully against each other against Dallas-Fort Worth that had had that problem for years. Remember, they used to say that the mayor of Fort Worth would, if he was going to Dallas for luncheon, would take his sandwich in a bag to eat it because he wasn't going to put any money in Dallas out of Fort Worth. I mean, even in Dallas-Fort Worth, they finally had to negotiate the airport, the DFW airport. So this is not something that is unique to a region. Regions have trouble thinking across political lines. It happens all the time. It's not a disease that is rampant only in the Rio Grande Valley. But we didn't know how to get out of that in order to politically gain strength. And what UTRGV began to give us practice in doing, and it's just beginning because we still have lots of divisional lines across sectors that need to be dissolved. But it gave us practice in beginning to think as a region and then had the advantage of putting all our numbers together. And that data then once compressed together and sold as a unit was much more powerful. And since we were already being thought of as the Valley elsewhere, okay, let them think of us as the Valley now. What does that mean in terms of higher education? We need a medical school. We need a school of podiatry. We need and then the whole game changed because they couldn't win, they meaning the powers that be that are outside of the Valley. They couldn't end the discussion by pitting us against each other. All of a sudden we had poder, we had some power based on the numbers and the strength of our argument. So the real win there, I think, for the Valley was learning, beginning to practice this notion of regional think. If you can do it now, if the universities could do it, or you hear people say, then surely we can do it with highways. We can plan, or if the university could do it, surely we can do it with whatever it is they're talking about now. So it was just a good moment to be able to take advantage of that think being different. Now, for us, it also meant we had Francisco Cigarroa as chancellor, who happened to be from Laredo. When was that ever going to happen again, right? When was Regent Powell, originally from Weslaco, who is now chairman of the Board of Regents? When was that going to happen again? We also had Pedro Reyes, executive vice chancellor for academic affairs from the Valley. We had me there, we had others. So when were we ever going to have this moment where all the people were in positions of authority to be able to make those decisions about what happens everywhere in our favor? So it was a little crack in the window that allowed us, not because we were so great and so smart, but we recognized an opportunity and then decided it's worth it. It's worth the risk of trying to make it through that window during this time.
Remarkable. Lots of questions, y'all? 2 or 3, and then Dr. Garcia is going to give us some closing remarks. Yes, I'm going to go full peripatetic Phil Donahue host on you, so younger people won't know who Phil Donahue is, but all right.
Hello, well, first of all, thank you very much for being here. I'm Carolina Gonzalez, I'm a freshman, I'm from Nuevo Laredo. I'm going to say in Spanish because I feel way more comfortable. So, crecí en Nuevo Laredo toda mi vida y estuve 12 años en una escuela católica privada y mexicana, cedo diversidad y llego aquí y no solamente el estigma que los demás tienen de mí, sino el llevarme al espejo y pensar cuándo voy a mejorar mi acento, cuándo voy a contar en inglés, cuándo voy a poder pedir mi orden en Chick-fil-A sin trabarme. ¿Cómo es que, principalmente Julieta, porque usted habló de eso, cómo pasaste esos obstáculos no solamente sociales, sino personales y en su mente, diarios?
Thank you for the question. And so so I had, when I became president, so I became the first Latina in the nation, right? I didn't know I was the first anything. You're just there at the moment and it's happening. A reporter later on figured it out and told me a couple of years later. So I had 3 strikes against me. I was too young. I was 37. I was female and I was Hispana. And so what normal in other places, that would have been an advantage, being young with a PhD from a good school, being female and being Hispanic. Often those are good checks. Those are, hey, come on in the door. But for us, it was not. It was a hard. So you never can erase that, and nor do you want to. You are who you are. You bring to your work who you are and what your background is. And just like I was talking about earlier, you view it as a strength, not as a weakness. One time, a colleague of mine and I were in New York looking for money because we're always looking for resources, right? And I was what I thought muy trajada. I had on a suit, a skirt, a top, the whole thing, the jacket. But he noticed it was a pinstripe suit. He said, "Why are you dressing like a man?" And I probably had a tie, not a man's tie, but I probably had a little blouse with a little scarf or something. He said, "Why are you dressing like a man?" And it just stabbed me in the heart. And was that what I was having to do at the time to fit in? I was in the UT system. There were 2 women presidents, 15 presidents, 2 women, Diana Natalicio from UTEP and myself. So I think there are times when you have to learn who you are and how to be and in what environment to use those different strengths from. So all I can tell you is that you start out with experimenting, owning who you are, being very proud of where you come from, and then learning how to have courage. And that aren't born with, I think. I learned it from Mary Rose Cardenas, a colleague that taught me how to be courageous and that you were going to not get creamed if you were too loud or too insistent, and that was your job. That's why you are where you're in a leadership position. So having role models around you makes a big difference. Learning from your mistakes, not to cave into them, but to strengthen yourself. That's not going to happen to me again. And one last thing. So I started out as more an outside the boardroom, wanting to throw Molotov cocktails, community organizing. And my father would watch me doing this. I was very young, had the babies very young, just finished school, and he'd say, "Honey, you might want to think of a different strategy." And he said, "I think you'd be better off in a boardroom making those arguments than outside gritando, And he was gently trying to guide who I would become. So you don't always get it right, but you listen to people around you that care for you and that understand what you're trying to do. And then you go into the storm.
Thank you. Question? Thoughts? Don't be shy. Yes.
Okay, hello. Thank you all for being here. My name is Mufado. I am a senior top scholar majoring in actuarial science. And the biggest thing that I think I noticed, and this was touched on a little bit, on the idea of bordering, debordering, or bordering, rebordering, and then debordering is kind of how it can also be personal. And I think, there's, given the amount of minorities that exist, even just in America, how does this work? Not just, when we think about places, but could this be applicable to our beings as well? Because I think not only is the way other people view us, but the way we view ourselves as well. How do you apply that to your sense of self in order to kind of escape a certain view that you might have about yourself?
I'll give a quick example. I think this is really good. One of the things I learned when I went from the Valley, this is pre-social media, to Harvard, was how different people saw me. And I was already, I grew up privileged in the Valley, and so I already had a feeling of difference, but it had a difference of privilege. When I went up to Harvard, it was, wow, you're from where? I mean, it's much the same sorts of comments you would get. And it wasn't intentionally insulting, but it did make me think differently about who I was. And what it made me realize was who we are is relational, right? And this is one of the big things in anthropology. We are our relationships and the relationships we don't have. And so when I started to define myself more relationally by choice, who I wanted to be around and who I wanted to associate with, it changed my borders of my identity. But I also was open to growing with those, because then when I moved to California, now I was somebody totally different, but I didn't feel any different, right? And this goes also to your question. You know, I'm one person in one place, and then I feel like I'm the same person, but I'm treated so very differently in others. And I think the lesson for the bordering is, one, we're relational, and those relationships shift over time, and that you have to choose very carefully who you want your relationships to be.
Yeah, I would second that. There's a relationship between the context in which you're in and how you see yourself, right? And I think about some of the material that I work with historically. For example, prior to 1948, most affluent neighborhoods had these things called race restrictive covenants. They were deed restrictions that were placed on property, and they're still the standard part of home selling and purchasing. They tell you where you can plant a tree, how close to the property line, very mundane things. And as part of that mundane list of things prior to 1948, were exclusions. You cannot sell this home to Black, Mexican, or Jews. Just like that, very mundane. But they were part of the structural inequality of the housing industry. And so, however one person saw themselves as an individual, they were still running into this very real barrier of how they were viewed in the relationship of this market, right? This housing market. And these are the kinds of contradictions that give rise to social movements, right? That give rise to beating down doors and then also finding ways into boardrooms to change those kinds of policies, right? And so I think that, and this even goes to the question from Nuevo Laredo, right? That, you know, there's a lot of power in being who you are and recognizing that the barriers placed in front of you aren't your problem, right? They weren't created by you, but they become your problem to change. And so I think that that's part of the power of historical research and memory and narrative, and the links that we make to the present day when we think about identity and how we should, you know, move through the world.
Thoughts on that, Edgar?
Well, I'll be brief. I don't have much to add. I do agree with the professors that sometimes people do put labels on you. I have a pretty heavy accent that I'm in denial about. Whenever I hear my voice and I recall, like, that's me, really? Because in my mind, I speak English with a less severe accent. But people do automatically assume, you know, border, immigration, the terms that we were talking about. You just have to kind of like know who you are and just keep pushing forward and do what you want to do, basically, and work hard to get it.
Well, thanks so much for all of our panelists. Before we get some concluding remarks, maybe un aplauso for our three panelists. And we're honored to have some closing remarks from Dr. Julieta Garcia. Do you want to come up here, or would you like the, yep.
The PUF Fund, Permanent University Fund, is a fund that generates its revenue from the oil and gas wells in West Texas. It was designed to feed, as a revenue stream, the University of Texas schools and Texas A&M schools. by the initial negotiation for the distribution of PUF dollars, A&M gets 1/3 of the revenue, UT gets 2/3. I think that's fair. That's that is uncontested to this day. I'm sure not in the dreams of people, but in fact it is. The reason I mention the Permanent University Fund is because I spent 20 plus years trying to get the Valley into the Permanent University Fund distribution. Because if you were at UT Pan American or at UT Brownsville as a president, and they would distribute funds at every Board of Regents meeting. Imagine what it would feel like if you were the president of one of these two institutions and you were sitting there and all your fellow presidents are getting revenues from a permanent university fund. And they would just leave us off the list completely. You know, they couldn't give it to us by law, and I won't go into the details of all of that, but so they would say, okay, UT San Antonio, you get $100 million. Medical school in San Antonio, you get $200 million, UT Austin, and et cetera. And you sat there. I remember sitting there one time in Galveston, and they were distributing PUF dollars. And I was just, I was almost insane. I was so upset. And I knew it was going to happen, but every time I'd get mad again, right? And the provost at the time, wonderful, brilliant fellow, and he kept saying, let's go for a walk. He was Cuban American, and he had a very heavy Cuban accent. You need to go for a walk. I don't want to go for a walk. And he would, just to make me cool down a little bit. It was so egregious. And it was for so many decades. One of the reasons that we were able to break that barrier was that we learned that if we started a brand new university, we could make it PUF eligible. We could never change the law, and I won't go into why not, to make Brownsville and Pan Am part of the distribution. But if we were willing to abolish, imagine the word, abolish a university that you would help start and abolish another university down the street, if we could abolish those two universities to create a new one, it could become PUF eligible. And when I was asked, would you take that risk? So of course. I mean, what's not to take? We've been fighting from the outside too long, trying to throw those Molotov cocktails. We need to be at the board table as an equal partner. So when you hear about what's happening at UT RGV, remember the PUF fund, because the biggest news is that we now get distributions every quarter. The president of UT RGV sits at the board table, and when there's a distribution every quarter, UT RGV gets its fair share. And guess what? The price of oil is very high right now. So we get a lot of revenues coming, and they can only be used for certain things. Don't get too excited. You can't use it for faculty salaries, unfortunately. You can use it only for capital expansion. So buildings, okay. Equipment, okay. There are things you can use it for. You can get really creative about it. But my point is, there's more to the story always than what you imagine. It wasn't just about let's cooperate, let's work on this deal together, let's represent ourselves as one. It was about revenues, because you're not equal until you're receiving the revenues. For our students, I could put them in a race in chess or in physics or anything else. But if I had them descalzos, if I had them barefoot running the race, how were they going to win? Even compete? When I was a student at UT, I learned they had 23 libraries at Austin. 23 libraries. I had one on our campus. I built a second one. How can you say you're wearing the same kind of tennis shoes to run the same race? How can you pretend that you have not enough resources for students, for faculty, for libraries, for equipment, when you really don't, just because you have UT next to your name? So I wanted the PUF story to get told, because I think it's an important part of the story of debordering. That has done more. Getting the PUF dollars distributed in the Rio Grande Valley through UT RGV will do more in the decades to come. The chancellor is gone. You have a new chancellor. The presidents are out. New presidents are in. It doesn't matter. That fund is coming in. That's what was important about that story. So chess. So I cannot leave you with just telling you the story about chess. Chess started out in Brownsville in an elementary school classroom because the teacher was given the troubled kids. And the teacher, young man, said, well, you know, I taught my son how to play chess, and that seemed to keep him occupied. Maybe it'll work with these boys. He taught him chess. The boys started playing chess. Pretty soon, he bragging about it in the faculty lounge. And his principal said, I'm going to put you up against the gifted school across the way and see how our boys do it. He goes, well, I'm just bragging in the teacher's lounge. They may not be that good. She said, too bad. I already scheduled the chess tournament. And you're going to go play the gifted school, whatever. So the bad boys won the chess tournament. So pretty soon, everybody was going to this teacher to have him teach teachers how to launch children in learning chess. Eventually, this was like an infection that spread throughout Brownsville. And pretty soon, everybody was playing chess. I mean, 5-year-olds just learning in pre-K and learning English for a second language for the first time. We're also learning how to play chess. Parents are having car washes and whatever they can to raise money to send their kids to competitions, because there was no money for chess kids to go to competitions. So parents were having to raise the money to do that. Today, look at the transportation budgets for chess teams in the Valley, and you'd be floored at how much money is being spent on them. But the end result was that our kids went to state championships and won from Brownsville, not because they were privileged, but because they were smart and they had an opportunity to learn. And they went to DC. They came in second the first year they went to the nationals. And then if you look at the chess competitions nationwide, every year since then, in elementary, in secondary, in high school, and now at the university, I'm no fool. Of course, I started a chess team at the university. That was easy. It's like not playing soccer. Of course, we play soccer. We're good at soccer. So it's learning what your strengths are. So kids now from Brownsville are known. You have one in the audience here in your top scholar program, because he's from Brownsville. He played chess. He competed. He got national competition. And ask him what he's going to be. He could be anything he wants to be. He's going to study engineering, right? Because if you can play chess and win, you can be an engineer. You can go to law school. You can go to medical school. Our children learned that the potential they have is like anybody else's. There's nothing wrong with the human capital in the Rio Grande Valley that a little bit of opportunity can't fix. So then we went to physics. And I remember leaving Austin. Well, I was in Austin one day for board meetings, and I'm listening to some people, and they're talking about the next physics conference. Now, you know, I'm UT Brown, so compare me against UT Dallas. And, you know, I was in high cotton, and it was kind of rough. And so somebody said, well, I hear there's going to be a physics conference this summer in Texas. And so he said, well, where's it going to be? And he goes, well, it's got to be UT Austin. And the other person said, no, it's not Austin. And then he said, well, then it's got to be UT Dallas, because those are the two big physics schools. San Antonio was building a physics program at the time, still not up there yet. And I'm listening to these guys, and I know it's going to be in Brownsville on South Padre Island. And the other fellow, the smarter one of the two, says, I think it's going to be at UT Brownsville. And the other guy says, why would it be in UT Brownsville? We competed for SpaceX. We convinced UT System that we had a chance at convincing Elon Musk to come to Texas. We were competing against 4 other states. High cotton again. We said, we have no clue if we can do this or not. But we had physics majors. We had 22 physicists doing gravitational wave astronomy at UT Brownsville. Now there's more at UT RGV. When you have the human capital, as well as you happen to be adjacent to the water, you happen to be closer to the equator, so that it diminishes the thrust of the rocket ship as it flows. All of this, it makes it sound like I know what I'm talking about, but I just learned from physicists about how you launch rocket ships. We now have a huge physics department. We are, and now UTRGV, is producing in the top 5 in the nation, the most Hispanic physics graduates. And we just got approved for a PhD in physics. Okay, so chess, physics, what else is before us? So now we have the medical school, and we got SpaceX, and Elon Musk is our best friend, and we'll see how this all works out. But so a paradigm shift can be real. You've seen it happen in the Rio Grande Valley. I'm on a board right now called Texas 2036. And the reason I'm on that board is not because I plan to be around in 2036, but because I want to help plan for what Texas will look like, what it will need in 2036 across many different sectors: education, transportation, health industry, economics, energy. And people are thinking then that what was said earlier, that what the Valley is and can be is what Texas is going to look like. The problem is, if we don't get those Hispanic kids better educated, Texas will not be a good place. We will not generate the tax revenue that we need as a state and build our economy. We're in a world of hurt if the characteristic of the Hispanic child in Texas is not better in 10, 20 years than it is today. So we better run faster, because what we've done so far is we have a good head start, but we've got to do a much better job with the Hispanic population in terms of success in school. I want to conclude with people who make decisions. So presidents you think are very powerful. We are not. We try to look like we are, and we have purview and power over some things. But the real decisions are made by regents, right? The regents are the bosses of the chancellors, who are the bosses of the presidents. So how do you get to be a regent? Well, you give some money to the right guy who wins as governor, and you get to become a regent. So all the public universities have regents. UT System has regents, A&M has regents, University of Houston has regents, Texas Tech has regents. And the reason I mention the regents are because they're the ones that decide where the new degrees are going to go, where the new programs are going to go, what your trajectory can look like, right? Driven by presidents, driven by faculty, driven by resources and needs. But finally, behind closed doors, they make the decisions. We've never had representation on Board of Regents from the Valley. We do now. We have a regent on Alonso Cantu, who's on the University of Houston board. We now have University of Houston offering courses in the Rio Grande Valley. We have Mike Hernandez, who sits on the Texas A&M board. Guess what? We have A&M offering courses in the Rio Grande. We have Janice Longoria, who was originally from the Valley. Her father was Senator Longoria at one time representing the Valley. And we have Dr. Nolan Perez, who is now on the Board of Regents for the University of Texas system. That's where the power lies for our future, is getting people who have earned their way on to Board of Regents, because that's where the decisions in the future will be. I don't know how Dr. Florier came up with this notion of I guess she's an anthropologist, right? But she taught me so much as I read through her work, and she allowed me to see ourselves through her eyes and through the eyes of an anthropologist, and allowed me to see my own family and all. I think her book is seminal in teaching us that we have to look at ourselves first as who we are, and then also as how we're seen, and that's important. Both of those are important. One need not limit the other, simply empower the other. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much for your attendance today.
Thank you, Dr. Julieta Garcia. Thank you, Dr. Jill Florier, for this book and for gathering this occasion for us, this grand. Thanks to all the people who organized it. You mentioned Batul and Christy and Melissa, Dr. Jerry Gonzalez, and the esteemed Edgar Sandoval from the New York Times. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you very much.